Welcome, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone back. I see a few new faces here, so if we haven't yet met, I'm Pat Brubaker, the principal. I'd be happy to speak to you during our coffee break and welcome you to senior college. And I've already said my sort of general welcome in the newsletter. I hope everyone had a wonderful summer. I think we're going to have an exciting fall. And with that, I'm not going to take any more time. Turn over the floor to Linda Hutchin, who will introduce our speaker today. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. Thanks, Pat. Welcome, everybody. Our first speaker of the fall term is Lorraine York. Now, Lorraine is a Canadian literary historian. She holds the Senator William McMaster Chair in Canadian Literature and Culture, there's a mouthful, at McMaster University. She's a Fellow of the Royal Society and a two-time winner of the President's Award for Graduate Supervision at MAC. But the really good news, folks, is that Lorraine's going to retire this year and she plans to join senior college. For me, that would be wonderful because it would bring it kind of full circle, right? I have known Lorraine since she was a graduate student. So it's nice. From those early days, I happily have watched her mature into the exceptional scholar, teacher, and mentor that she has become. Lorraine is a Canadianist with a distinguished reputation in both literary and interdisciplinary domains, but she's also made a name for herself through her theoretical work on both collaboration and, especially lately, literary celebrity. She's the author of numerous books. I'm not going to list them all. She has written two important ones on the literatures of Canada that are entitled The Other Side of Dailiness, Photography in the Works of Alice Munro, Timothy Finlay, Michael Ondaatje, and Margaret Lawrence, and then Front Lines, the fiction of Timothy Finlay. With her book called Rethinking Women's Collaborative Writing, Power, Difference, Property, Lorraine turned her focus in a way away from literary to institutional analysis. A subsequent volume, entitled Literary Celebrity in Canada, was the first study ever of the impact of celebrity on Canadian literary culture. And for her, it was the first step on the road to her influential project on Margaret Atwood's celebrity role and status, both here and around the world. In this book, she also looked at Michael Ondaatje and Carol Shields, did this all within the historical context of earlier Canadian celebrities. She followed this up with a book on Atwood alone called Margaret Atwood and the Labor of Literary Celebrity. In this, she looks back to and through Atwood's vast archive, but then she also looks forward to this writer's quite clever manipulation of social media in order to study precisely the labor of Atwood herself in creating her celebrity persona. So this work on celebrity has taken Lorraine into many different scholarly areas well beyond the literary. Areas such as cultural theories of affect, feminist media studies, and politics. She further refined this interdisciplinary focus in her 2018 book entitled Reluctant Celebrity, Affect and Privilege in Contemporary Stardom. As its title implies, it may be only from a position of privilege that a celebrity can be reluctant. But I believe that today we'll be hearing something from her forthcoming book, which addresses not reluctance, but eagerness for celebrity status. Its title, and I love this, is to be Unseemly, Affect, Gender, New Media, and the Denunciation of Fame Hunger. She freely admits, by the way, and I can't resist saying this, that she really always wanted to write a book called Unseemly, which I think is, I totally get that. Today's talk has the intriguing title, as you see, of Yes, I'm a Witch, Yoko Ono, Para-Celebrity as Parasitism, and the racialization of fame hunger. Please join me in welcoming Lorraine York.
Get rid.
Thank you, and welcome on this absolutely gorgeous morning. So as Linda mentioned, yes, this unseemly book, in all senses of the word, examines 12 women from the 17th century to the present. What was I thinking? In case I wonder to myself why it took me 8 years to write it, this might be why. These are women who have been widely understood, or in some instances have understood themselves as being desirous for fame. So all the way from the natural philosopher of the 17th century, Margaret Cavendish, Aphra Behn, the first woman writing in English to have made a living from her pen. The 17th century Venetian composer and singer Barbara Strozzi, 18th century writer of rather scandalous novels, Eliza Haywood, actress Sarah Bernhardt, visual artist Helen Frankenthaler, Yoko Ono, our subject today, Paris Hilton. Yes, I did. Paris Hilton, Kim Kardashian. We can speak after if you wish. And in the political realm, American political realm specifically, Hillary Rodham Clinton, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and inevitably Madonna. My central argument in the book is that the uneasiness about women desiring fame that has given rise to public shaming across these centuries is actually a reaction to women taking up emergent media of their day and using them well. In vivid contrast, then, to the frequent assumption that fame hunger is sort of the last refuge of the untalented, I argue that women who've been accused of an unseemly thirst for fame happen to be especially adept at forms of cultural expression that are emergent and boundary breaking. So this is an early version, which has now been, of course, very much compacted down as editing tends to encourage you to do, of a chapter on the American abstract expressionist painter Helen Frankenthaler and Yoko Ono. And I brought them together because I thought, here are two women whose connections with powerful male celebrities led to accusations that they had somehow instrumentalized their emotional lives in an unseemly pursuit for fame. So I'm just going to jump right in. Like Helen Frankenthaler, Yoko Ono was drawn to the New York art scene of the 1950s and 60s. After moving back and forth between Japan, where she was born, and the United States, where her banker father was assigned on business, about which more later. Like Frankenthaler, she enrolled in a prestigious progressive college, in her case, Sarah Lawrence, where she pursued artistic experimentation inspired by avant-garde 12-tone music. As her educational experience might suggest, she was, also like Frankenthaler, a child of privilege. The Onos and her mother's family, the Yasudas, occupied high ranks in Japanese society, the latter sometimes being compared to the American Rockefellers. But in other respects, the path that Ono took could not have been more divergent from that of Helen Frankenthaler. Turning her attention to the visual arts in the 1960s, she bypassed abstract expressionism in favor of performance art that was ephemeral, event-based. As she would later reflect, she found the abstract expressionists affectively restrained, overly cool in their approach to art making. She famously recalled of those days, "I wanted to throw blood." In her view, the abstract expressionists had not done enough to activate the viewers and to turn them into participants. As she once declared in an interview, "The ultimate goal for me is a situation in this society where ordinary housewives visiting each other and waiting in the living room will say, 'I was just adding some circles to your beautiful de Kooning painting.'" Try doing that. Ono was advocating for an avant-garde art then that would take abstract expressionism and its experimentation further to what art historians have subsequently and famously dubbed the dematerialization of art and the consequent rise of conceptual art. In search of these values, Ono became a major figure in the Fluxus art movement, though it's worth noting that she embraced ephemerality so enthusiastically that she heartily disapproved of giving the movement a name. Didn't think you should name it at all. But it was founded by the Lithuanian-American artist George Masiunas in the early 1960s, and was heavily influenced by the Dadas. Fluxus, as its name suggests, embraced process rather than product, and set itself against the capitalist and commercial bearings of the art market. Fluxus also set itself against the ethos of the artist as a specially endowed seer and held that anyone could produce art. Accordingly, artistic design and control were replaced by chance. And while chance certainly played a role in abstract expressionist painters' techniques, Fluxus took the workings of serendipity to a whole new level as the art object itself became conceptual and fleeting. The theory and practice of the dematerialization of art dovetailed neatly with Fluxus's anti-capitalist philosophy, for in their eyes, the immateriality of conceptual art allowed it to evade capitalist capture, the buying, the selling, and the archiving of an art object. As the 1960s wore on, though, Ono found that Fluxus was not quite as free-form as it claimed to be, and she chafed under some of its less publicized exclusions. In particular, it became clear to her that Fluxus devalued the contributions of women, and especially women of color. Her Manhattan loft was the site of many Fluxus events. In making those events possible, she and other women associated with the group shopped for groceries, cooked, and in the case of Ono, actually made furniture out of crates to outfit the space. Meanwhile, men in the group, like the avant-garde composer Lamonte Young, claimed the title of event organizer. As Ono later declared, being a woman and doing my thing in the loft days was especially hard because I was a woman. Most of my friends were all male and they tried to stop me being an artist. They tried to shut my mouth and tried to get me, that is, tried to identify me as an owner of the loft who helped in concerts. She recalled at one point having it out with one of those male artist friends, telling him, "You don't introduce to the critics that this is a chick who owns this loft. You don't say to the reporter, let's come to my loft." As the art historian Midori Yamamura summed it up, Ono was marginalized even at her own loft due to her gender and ethnicity. In sketching here the ways in which Yoko Ono as a figure in the New York avant-garde art scene of the 1960s occupied a very different space from that of Helen Frankenthaler, I've deliberately delayed mentioning the factor that most differentiated these two women's experience of celebrity, Ono's relationship with the musician John Lennon. While Frankenthaler's associations with powerful men like the art critic Clement Greenberg and the painter Robert Motherwell operated within the relatively restricted orbit of the art world, well, of course, Ono's reached out to the realm of global popular stardom. In drawing attention in the first place to Ono's pre-Beatles career, I foreground what was, in fact, the case, that Ono was well on her way to establishing a place for herself, albeit in a circumscribed avant-garde field of production, before she was swept up by Beatlemania in 1966. For it was Lennon who first approached her when he attended the advance opening of her show at London's Indica Gallery, sent there on the advice of Paul McCartney, who took an active interest in contemporary visual arts. She was the artist on display, and Lennon was her audience. In fact, she claimed afterwards not to have even realized that the young man whom she showed around her exhibition on that day was famous. As she recalled, one of them being the art students helping to set up the exhibition, said, "That was John Lennon, one of the Beatles." I said, "Oh, really? I didn't know." Okay. But once that relationship took shape and was publicly acknowledged, charges of fame hunger rained down upon Yoko Ono, and as I'm sure many of you know, they persisted for decades. Of all the accusations of fame hunger in the past 4 centuries that I examine in the book, even allowing for historical specificity and conditions, those directed against Yoko Ono are, I think, the most intense, as well as the most long-lived. As I researched Ono, I kept a kind of running record of the epithets that were most frequently applied to her during the period when she was associated with Lenin. So that's 1966 until his death in 1980. And here we go. Hypnotist, addict, hoarder, no talent, succubus, lunatic fringe, inscrutable, unglamorous, infiltrator, unprofessional, prison keeper, sorceress, avaricious, custodian, witch, traitor, bad mother, devil, exploiter, parasite. Many of these gendered and racialized insults bear directly on Ono's putative hunger for fame, as though as a succubus, infiltrator, exploiter, or parasite, she were actually sucking the fame from John Lennon's body. The less frequent admiring epithets applied to her mostly after 1980 included mentor, inspiration, muse, resurgent artist, precursor. I noticed, though, how some of these ostensibly positive labels really produced a kind of backhanded delegitimization, allied as they are with the terms of abuse that were directed towards her. So muse, inspiration, and precursor, for example, invoke a condition that I also detected in Helen Frankenthaler's career, the tendency to see the artist as perpetually in relation to other artists, usually male artists, rather than an innovator on her own terms. But I think there's another way to engage with some of these painful and harmful accusations of parasitical fame hunger that were directed towards Yoko Ono, one that does not leave Yoko Ono as inevitably and always victimized by them, a way that Ono as artist shows us. And that's a thoroughgoing reshuffling of the subject-object relation that explodes the celebrity host parasite dichotomy between the famous on one hand and the fame hungry hangers on the other. In previous chapters in the book, I refer to the concept of paracelebrity, and that's simply the perceived gaining of celebrity through one's association with a famous person. And I've noted its instability as a conduit for a serious recognition of worth. It was, to go back in time here for a moment, it was advantageous for the composer and singer Barbara Strozzi, as an emerging composer in 17th century Venice, to have her compositions included in anthologies alongside the works of more seasoned Venetian musical luminaries, or men. For Aphra Behn, there was some benefit to be gained by having her name associated, however loosely, with the court poetry circle of the Earl of Rochester, who wrote very scandalous verses. However, such links could also provide a foothold for calumny and sniping, as they did when Bain's association with the Rochester circle confirmed in some quarters her reputation for louche behavior. But still, nothing in these earlier accounts compares with the way in which paracelebrity promoted outright hatred of Yoko Ono. Her attainment of celebrity by association joined forces with a long history of racist anti-Asian tropes of parasitism and contagion to produce the most perniciously toxic accusation of fame hunger that I have found. Now, these accusations went beyond calumny. Charges of fame hunger against Ono really ran the full gamut, from verbal attack to cruelly violent acts. Some English fans of the Beatles would fling racist abuse at her when they appeared in public. In 1968, when she and Lennon were arraigned on charges of drug possession in London, one of those fans went further, pulling Ono's hair as she ascended the courthouse steps. Another sent her a parcel containing a doll with long black hair whose plastic skin was darkened with charcoal and whose torso was impaled with pins, accompanied by a note that read, "Leave John alone."
Ugh.
This onslaught of hatred was one cause of the couple's move to New York in 1971 and also of their brief separation in 1973. As Ono recalled of that very difficult time, I really didn't want to come back together because I thought it would be the same thing all over again. The entourage, people being so jealous, whispering to him, and the whole world hating me. And also, I lost my artistic credit. I couldn't make anything without people attacking it. My career was killed, and my dignity as a person was totally gone. As Ono movingly suggests here, her identity as an avant-garde artist and her racial and gender identities became intertwined objects of hatred. Her conceptual art was widely ridiculed by Beatles fans who disapproved of the match. And when she released her first solo album, Yoko Ono Plastic Ono Band, in 1970, Duncan Fallowell, reviewing it in The Spectator, doubted that, in his words, this album will receive the attention it deserves. Such is the antipathy toward Yoko Ono that she can do no right. Even her studio habits came in for very severe criticism. Often she would keep her planned song list to herself, only letting the studio musicians in on the arrangement and the sequencing a few minutes before the session began. Critics denounced this practice as very unprofessional. However, I'm not the first to point out that no one ever accused Miles Davis or Bob Dylan of unprofessionalism when they did the very same thing. Sadly, while some Beatles fans were pillaring her as unprofessional and as a flaky avant-garde artists were distancing themselves from her because of her association with Lennon and the world of commodified popular music. So there she was, moving in the space between the avant-garde and the popular and facilitating their exchange. Ono was despised by aficionados of both. The language of parasitism particularly came into play in attacks that labeled Ono a supernatural, power-thirsty villain, the witch, the succubus. In the aftermath of the breakup of the Beatles in the 1970s, when Ono and Lennon explored their solo and collaborative careers more quietly in New York, Ono was widely blamed for sequestering Lennon away from his adoring public and imprisoning him in their Manhattan apartment so that he might serve her desires rather than those of his fans. It was basically a gendered reversal of the Bluebeard myth. As Ono recalled, I felt castrated. Before, I was doing all right, thank you. My work might not have been selling much. I might have been poorer, but I had my pride. But the most humiliating thing is to be looked at as a parasite. I read what I think is a really complex trope of Ono as castrated parasite in the light of Vivian L. Wang's reconsideration of the possibilities of performed parasitism in Asian American women's performance art in a wonderful book that appeared with Duke a few years ago called Surface Relations: Queer Forms of Asian American Inscrutability. Wang suggests that performing parasitism has the potential to shift racist and misogynist discourse and to allow for what she calls a holding together of distance and intimacy, one that names the particular crux of Asian and feminine becoming, one that cannot entirely refuse the language of hospitality in the register of the real, but that is also not wholly delimited by such a discourse. I would extend this possibility, this holding together of discourses of distance and intimacy, of hospitality and inhospitality, to another of Ono's performances, that of the parasitical, fame-hungry subject. Accordingly, I devote the rest of this talk to Ono's shifting of intimacy and distance, subject and object, within the very discourses of celebrity dependency that were used to attack her. While I've lingered initially on the racist and misogynist treatment of Ono because I think it's important to acknowledge how they outstrip in intensity the kinds of fame hunger accusations I've traced elsewhere, The greater part of my analysis is devoted to Ono's strategy of upsetting those discourses of celebrity parasite and host. These discourses are both evident and disrupted in notions of Ono as the paracelebrity who is always inevitably viewed in relation to. To begin on the most basic level, the relationship with Lenin that activated those brutal accusations of fame hunger in the first place was a profoundly unstable mixture of dependencies and powers. On one hand, it's possible, and I think we can and should do this, we should acknowledge frankly the ways in which the connection with Lenin may have benefited her career, just as one can honestly acknowledge the advantages that accrued to Helen Frankenthaler because of her association with prominent men in the art world. And we can do this without having recourse to charges of parasitism or self-interest. And those advantages include access to creative connections and opportunity. It includes an improved financial situation. It includes a wider audience. On the other hand, though, the drawbacks of Ono's paracelebrity, as we've already glimpsed, were enormous. In the liner notes to her musical compilation, Ono Box, the critic Robert Palmer famously declared that, and I quote him, "It's quite likely that having John Lennon fall in love with her was the worst thing that could have happened to Yoko Ono's art career." Still, so airtight, so exclusive a statement of harm, however understandable it might be, obscures Ono's persistence and the power of her subversive performance of that host-parasite relationship. Harms were everywhere apparent. My approach doesn't seek to downplay them. Indeed, what fans often understood to be the harms practiced by Ono were instead harms done to her. Her biographer, Donald Brackett, quotes Ono's recollection that it was Lennon, not her, for example, who insisted on her spending time with the band, which was one of the, you may know, widespread cause of fan disgruntlement. Ono said, "I didn't particularly want to be one of them. But by that time, he had got all the avant-garde friends of mine out of my life. So I had nobody to play music with." Astoundingly, her biographer doesn't follow up on Ono's description of Lennon's, well, I think we can call it a scraping of her artistic past and her connections. So in any account of the widening of Ono's artistic world that is laid at the door of her association with Lennon, I think we must also take account of the way in which her artistic world was also diminished by the experience. So in addition to what we might call this cost-benefit analysis of the relationship that I've been carrying out here, whose intricate power relations dissolve that very dichotomy, the debate about who benefited from and who influenced whom is capable of a similar redrawing of that parasite-host dynamic of fame hunger. Charges of Ono's single-minded pursuit of Lennon and his fame framed her as, ironically, both dependent and calculatingly powerful. One such myth that was widely promulgated in the early years of their association was that during recording sessions, she would follow Lennon everywhere, even to the washroom, and that this disruption of the group's working dynamic led ultimately to the band's demise. This impression was partly created by the studio footage that was released in the 1970 documentary Let It Be, that actually did show Ono in the studio while the band was working. Of the charge that she even accompanied Lennon to the bathroom, years later, Ono explained, "He made me go with him. He thought that if he left me alone with the other Beatles, even for a minute, I might go off with one of them." Yeah, sure. Ono's claim that she was not a disruptive force in the studio was firmly substantiated by a later documentary film, Peter Jackson's 2021 series, The Beatles Get Back, which revealed in its fuller footage a veritable parade of other family members and friends dropping into the studio while the Beatles were at work. Ono's presence was, by comparison, far less distracting. In the earlier, actually, McCartney at one point ridicules the notion that Yoko's presence was unusual, let alone destructive, joking that it would be absurd for anyone to think that the Beatles would fall apart because, in his words, Yoko sat on an amp. Ono took these charges of simultaneous dependency and power that fueled hatred against her, and she reperformed them. A striking example is the famous Annie Leibovitz photographic portrait of Ono and Lennon that I am still trying to get permission to reproduce, that was taken eerily on the day that Lennon was assassinated. So here, as you can see, or as I hope you can see, Ono fully dressed and facing largely outward from her frontal position, plays off against an undressed profile shot Lennon curling infant-like into her body. When he saw the image, Lennon declared to Leibovitz, "You've captured our relationship exactly." I do not have time this morning, I'm afraid, to peel back the layers of that onion. Not even going to try. While Elizabeth Ann Lindau and others read Lennon's words as an acknowledgement of his dependence on her as this mothering figure, as when he nicknamed her Mother Superior, I think that the photograph as a collaborative performance, co-created by Lennon, Ono, and Leibovitz, discloses further layers of fluctuating power relations. Reperforming the power over Lennon that Ono haters despised, Ono is also reversing traditional European art historical gendered relations between clothed men and naked women, most explicitly figured in Edouard Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe, while also revising harmful images of Asian women's bodies being displayed for the pleasure of white men. It's not a simple reversal, though, is it? You'll notice Lennon frames Ono's face with his left arm and hand and appears even to be grasping her hair with his right hand. Still, performing her widely hated self and having the result become this challenging mixture of the affirmative and the subservient was a move that Ono, as I will show, fully incorporated into her performance art. Slowly, ever so slowly, in the years following Lennon's death, art critics and musicologists came to revise their notion of Ono as both dependent on his artistic originality and destructive in her artistic influence on him, acknowledging the ways in which Ono's art influenced his. Her instruction paintings, as they were called, conceptual verbal artworks that called upon the viewer to do something or to imagine something. Here's an example from her project, Grapefruit. Imagine the clouds dripping. Dig a hole in your garden to put them in. Well, these works led straight to one of the pair's most revered cultural productions, the song Imagine. And the famous bed-ins protesting the Vietnam War were Fluxus performances writ large. As Lisa Carver reminds us, he was with her. She got him into art, into feminism, into insurrection, pointing out that Ono connected Lennon with activists like Bobby Seale, Abby Hoffman, and Angela Davis. I must reference here actually something that I'm wearing as an example of this kind of reversal. A t-shirt that I was told about. And here I recognize with thanks Rochelle Sabaran from the McMaster Communication, New Media, and Cultural Studies PhD program, and Christina Bada, musicologist and chair of Communication and Media Studies at McMaster, both of whom told me on quite separate occasions that I had to get this t-shirt. Pre-tariff sent from California. So all of this sounds like straightforward dualistic reversal and reclamation, right? He was with her. But I would argue that Ono, in continuing to publicly influence Lennon, even in the face of ferocious attacks on her as a mind-controlling succubus, performed the thing that was the object of hatred. Rather than issuing denials, stepping back, performing alternate behaviors, she stepped in. And in so doing, she both claimed and exploded those hateful representations. Looking more broadly over the years of Ono's artistic career, she performed another type of dichotomy busting, a transnational artistry that eroded distinctions between the art worlds of the East and the West. Japan, the United States, and England, the primary sites of her creative life, became national sites of both belonging and unbelonging in Ono's art. There's no question that Japanese culture energized her thinking throughout her career. Vera Mackey compares her instruction paintings to Zen koans that stretch one's sense of the possible and therefore invite one to shift their perspective. Other critics have linked her performance art rhythms and gestures, as well as her signature musical use of the scream, to kabuki. Grapefruit, that collection of instruction paintings, was originally published in a mixture of English and Japanese, with about a third of the conceptual works appearing in both languages. And Ono would use the very instruments of Japanese art, like calligraphy and sumi ink, in her early Fluxus performances. But the relationship is more complicated than that. For Ono's experiences working in Japan, the United States, and England destabilize any pat assertions of comfortable national belonging, or for that matter, of her role as cultural intermediary between East and West. To begin with, her childhood experiences of the US and Japan were mixed, to say the least. She recalls of her early years in the States that, and I quote her, "Some people threw stones at us in the streets. We were not welcomed." But when she returned to Japan with her family in the 1940s and experienced the 1945 firebombing of Tokyo, she was still an outsider. Junri recounts that Ono was teased by other children for being batakuzai, butter-smelling, or in other words, westernized, Americanized. So while some see Ono's later 1962 trip to Japan as a triumphant welcome to a more adventurous avant-garde scene, there's plenty of evidence that Ono was regarded with jealousy and disapproval there, pre-Beatles, both because of her her flaunting of gendered and sexual proprieties, and because of her supposed over-reliance on American avant-garde artists like John Cage, who was enormously influential on her. She was, both sexually and artistically, batakuzai. 4 years later, when her relationship with Lennon became public, she was once again criticized in the Japanese press for being too openly sexual, though Ono has pointed out that she found that women in Japan were much more sympathetic to her than men were. A coolness towards Ono, though, persisted in the Japanese press for some time. And for that matter, journalists still tend to use katakana syllabic script to render her name, a script mostly used to transcribe words from other languages. And so there's distance there, right? In England, while she initially had these hopes of a warm reception as an emerging artist and the possibility of a breakthrough when her 1966 Indica Gallery show attracted attention, her relationship with Lennon foreclosed all of that. The intensity of English fan hatred of Ono that I've already described has been suggestively read by Leslie Bow as a reaction to what fans implicitly saw as a betrayal of English national certainties, a racialized interruption of the homosocial allegiances of the band of white lads who defined the nation. I'd add that the Second World War was not far in the past, right? And it, too, played an enormous role in legitimizing and consolidating white English sociality, as it arguably continues to do today. For a Japanese American woman to appear to infiltrate and disrupt the Beatles set off a torrent of abuse that was deeply embedded in the nation's patriotic wartime and post-wartime imaginary. So nation, race, and gender conspired to position Ono as a suspiciously mobile, rootless destroyer, But Ono dealt with this persistent rebuffing by nations and fandoms by making mobility and restlessness her artistic calling card. Once again, performing back to her haters the version of her that they sought to impose. This mobility characterizes her remarkable artistic journey through and between all sorts of genres and media. Like the other artists that I examine in the book, Ono was associated with new and emerging and innovative media and methods, though she takes that reputation to an intensive pitch, constantly moving from one art form or practice to another before the prior one has even really solidified. This casting off of the restrictions of calcifying practices is, of course, an avant-garde posture par excellence, and Ono adopted it at warp speed. Her Fluxus Loft events of around 1960 have been hailed as historic experiments that predated the critical labeling of conceptual art. In the realm of music, the critic Robert Palmer observed that Ono used a much wider variety of international percussion instruments and their rhythms than the standard issue rock band drum kit. For this reason, she's sometimes hailed as an early advocate of so-called world music. As if that weren't enough, she's also widely recognized as a precursor of punk. As authoritative a source as Malcolm McLaren, the manager of the Sex Pistols, called her song Don't Worry Yoko, with its wrenching screams, the first punk record. Sonic Youth's Thurston Moore sings Bow Down to the Queen of Noise in his solo song Ono Soul. In cinema, you're welcome. Film critic Scott MacDonald credits Ono with the introduction of the serial structuring in avant-garde film that would prove so important in the works of Michael Snow, Ernie Gare, Hollis Frampton, and Robert Huot. One example in Ono's filmic oeuvre is a series of naked bums walking away from her in her 1966 short film Number 4, Bottoms. So the sheer variety of media in which Ono took an early lead is really astounding. But so too is the pattern of Ono quickly passing from one realm of creativity of another, having lit a flame like the classic film shot of the action hero walking calmly away from the conflagration they've just set off. There wasn't a formulated, sedimented art practice that Ono didn't flow away from. For example, bringing this a little bit closer to our moment, in the 2000s, so that was in her 70s, Ono became a favorite of the remix dance scene. At first, she was hesitant to give her blessing to artists to mix and experiment with works of hers and works of hers and Lennon's that she had worked hard to conceptualize and bring into being, and over which she felt, I think understandably, a measure of protectiveness. But then realizing that according to her own artistic credo, dating back to her Fluxus days, that her art belonged to others too, she once more walked away from the authoritatively defined art object. And by the end of that decade, the 2000s, the aughts, she had added 6 #1 dance hits to her credit. For that matter, she did her own remixes of the various media she had worked in during her long career. As Midori Yamamura rightly points out, Ono, by combining painting, performance art, conceptual art, music, sculpture, more, was a major innovator in the practice of what came to be called intermedia, that is, intergeneric works of art, a coinage that was ironically credited to a male Fluxus colleague of hers, the artist Dick Higgins, in 1965. Another point of contact between Ono and the earlier putatively fame-hungry women artists is their capacity for doing business. Often, I've observed down the centuries, what detractors decry as an inordinate thirst for fame amounts to a woman's talent for operating successfully in the artistic market. It was so for Margaret Cavendish, Aphra Behn, Eliza Haywood, Sarah Bernhardt for sure, Helen Frankenthaler, and it was certainly so for Yoko Ono, who especially in the last half of the 1970s and in the years following Lennon's death in 1980, showed herself to be a most canny manager of the finances. In contrast with the other figures I've mentioned, though, Ono's profile as a businesswoman was highly charged because of those forces of racism operating in concert with misogyny. None of the women I've examined has been so reviled specifically for business acumen as has Yoko Ono. After the birth of Ono's and Lennon's son, Sean, in 1975, Ono gradually took over the couple's finances, largely because Lennon was inept at such arrangements and had already squandered a remarkable portion of the enormous sums of money that he had earned as a Beatle. Ono in the late 70s made a series of lucrative investments, and to be fair, a few unsuccessful ones, especially in real estate and, of course, art, because she knew the field. But as her biographer, Donald Brackett, points out, and I quote him here, for public purposes, Yoko only spoke obliquely of her business activities. Again, while Brackett doesn't pursue the reasons for Ono's reticence, I would say it has a great deal to do with that decades-long experience of fame-hunger accusations. So to openly identify herself as the financial manager of the couple would simply add fuel to those fires of old accusations that Ono had only ever been attracted by Lennon's enormous wealth. These accusations increased in volume in the aftermath of Lennon's death, when Ono's handling of their finances inevitably became a matter of public knowledge because of her stewardship of his estate. Selling Lennon's share of the Beatles' catalog, for example, to Sony, while retaining royalties from his solo work, much of it done in collaboration with her. While Ono's manager, you're having to look at this bum through all this. Oh, we'll leave it there. Why not? While Ono's management of her, I didn't think of that question of visual timing, you know? While Ono's management of her late husband's estate won positive recognition from many eventually, it was punctuated by recurring accusations of selling out Lennon's legacy. So she released 5 recordings of Lennon's work in the 1980s and was promptly accused of exploiting his death. The accusations reached a crescendo when his son from his first marriage, Julian, posed legal challenges to Lennon's estate. Julian claimed, among other things, that Ono had made him pay for postcards that he'd sent to his father. But in designating Ono the evil, greedy stepmother, few stopped to wonder why Lennon himself hadn't put Julian in the will in the first place. And there were other scandals too, such as her selling of casts of Lennon's bloodied shirt and replicas of his blood-smeared glasses, acts which the tabloid press in England was particularly eager to excoriate, not even bothering to ask whether these were works of art, albeit of a decidedly morbid nature. But anyone who knows the least bit about Ono's art would not be surprised that she would memorialize the traumatic event of Lennon's assassination in such a way. In terms of her financial decisions relating to the estate, then Ono simply could not win. If she withheld Lennon's materials, she was perceived as a selfish hoarder, and that's where the hoarder epithet comes in. If she released them, she was cashing in. So I would say that this treatment was once again driven partly by racializing tropes of Asian greed, particularly in the case of Ono, whose family on both sides were bankers. Her maternal grandfather, Zenjiro Yasuda, founding the Bank of Tokyo, and her father, Yasuki Ono, a former classical pianist, who became eventually the San Francisco head of the Yokohama Specie Bank. And while, few disgruntled Beatles fans would be aware of these details of Ono's family history, the suspicion of Asian financial dominance has a political context specific to the 1970s and 80s. During these decades, as many of us will recall, Western economies saw a decline in their manufacturing sectors and felt threatened, outmaneuvered by evidence of Japanese success in North American consumer markets. particularly in the automobile industry, as drivers facing the global oil shortage that was exacerbated by the Yom Kippur War and the Iranian Revolution were drawn to more fuel-efficient Japanese cars. As time went on, Ono's response to these charges was typical of her strategy for dealing with other instances of hatred, to present herself as performing exactly the actions and attitudes she's accused of. She said, "I'm sure John would be happy I'm still keeping him out there. There's a commercial aspect, yes, but I mean, why not? I was a partner, and I still feel that I am a partner." Yes, but why not? This response typifies Ono's handling of the various accusations of fame hunger and opportunism that came her way. A blurring of those subject-object boundaries that says, in effect, I will perform the worst that you can imagine of me, and in so doing, reflect that back to you and implicate you in your own hatred. This is a dynamic well recognized in performance art, and Ono has made powerful use of it for decades as a means of responding to insults and epithets. It's a strategy that reignites her agency and that allows her to evade the narrative of victimization that her life story, as it's often told, appears to consign her to. As Vivian Wang, writing about Asian American performances of silent inscrutability as noisy hospitality, observes, to appear through forms that do not reproduce such hatred calls for subtle strategies that work toward minoritarian endurance and grace. Well, Ono's best-known performance work, Cut Piece, powerfully displays, I would say, exactly these dynamics at work. Subtle strategies that work toward minoritarian endurance and grace, a noisy hospitality. The score or directions for the artwork are as follows. I have them on the screen. Performer sits on stage with a pair of scissors in front of him. It is announced that members of the audience may come on stage, one at a time, to cut a small piece of the performer's clothing to take with them. Performer remains motionless throughout the piece. Piece ends at the performer's option. Ono performed, she's shown here performing the piece. She performed it in Kyoto, Tokyo, New York, London, and Paris. And other artists of various genders have also performed it. For Ono added initially, way back then, to the directions, the proviso that the work could be performed by anybody regardless of gender identity. Cut Piece has, though, been widely read in recent decades as a work of feminist performance art that critiques gendered violence. And there are moments in the filmed, I mean, we still have records of some of these performances. In these filmed New York and London performances, you know, there are moments where male audience members make sexualizing comments, either from the sidelines or as they do the cutting. And there was one instance where one audience member came up and assumed a very violent stance over Ono's body, scissors in hand, you know, aimed down at Ono's head. So those moments certainly substantiate that reading. Ono's much quoted commentary on the piece, though, diverges from that feminist reading, for she has said that the piece is about a Buddhist form of total giving and a recognition of the audience's power to take and create that decenters the artist's choice about what to give. Vivian Wang reads Cut Piece as a powerful play on expectations of Asian hospitality, and, to quote them, hospitable practices of Asian femininity in order to disrupt a capitalist and imperialist economy and temporality. Ono, they write, becomes simultaneously host of her performance and hostage to Orientalist discourse. All of these readings, I think, feminist, anti-racist, art power subversive, are not at loggerheads, but are intertwined in this profoundly unsettling work of art that mixes host and hostage positions, whether relating to gender, race, or art. Building on Cut Piece's intersectional richness, I would add that the work also breaks up the host-hostage dichotomies of fame hunger accusations. That she performed cut piece long before she met Lennon, I think is little to the point, since as Ono repeatedly testifies, her work accrues layers of meaning over time that may not have been available earlier in its performance history. And that is kind of classic performance art thinking as well. So Ono performs silent endurance of the cuts and harms of decades of public mistreatment. You know, that horrific image of the pin-studded doll, right, comes to mind once more. But in so doing, she also plays host to the audience's choice of how to treat her. In some performances of the piece, some audience members cried out in protest against other audience members' acts of cutting that they found violent or disturbing. Violent act and protest both become part of the work of art. And thereby, Ono, the artist, is, as Wang would say, both host and hostage. Both the power unleashing the audience's performance of how they treat her and the silent giving victim of the taking, though with the proviso that she can, after all, choose when to draw the performance to a close. The line between host and hostage is thereby, I wouldn't say so much redrawn, as it is held in mobile tension, as the artist offers their own choice of the moment to end the performance and of the moments they choose to endure it. So, in conclusion, looking back over the hatred directed towards her in the late 60s and 70s, Yoko Ono similarly shuffled and diffused the subject and the object of that hatred. She said, I wasn't prepared for it. I was really surprised by it, but so was John. We went through that, and it was a learning process. Also, I think it was a learning process for John's fans. Now, I don't know about you, but personally, I'm a little bit skeptical about just how much the hate-bearing Beatles fans did take away from this performance. Just as one might query the capacity of scissors and sexual innuendo-wielding audience members to contemplate their artistic choices. But again, this is classic Fluxus performance theory. The art experience is the one that holds the potential to alter both artist and audience. In her life and in her art, Yoko Ono has, in her defiant vulnerability, performed the hatred that has rained down on her, both owning and disowning her fame-hungry persona. And to quote her song, yes, I'm a witch, I'm a bitch. I don't care what you say. My voice is real. My voice speaks truth. I don't fit in your ways. I'm not going to die for you. You might as well face the truth. I'm gonna stick around for quite a while. Thank you.